The Crimson Slaughter, formerly known as the Crimson Sabres, are a renegade warband of Chaos Space Marines. Under the leadership of Cranon the Relentless, they have caused terror across the Imperium. In the previous episode, we looked at how the noble Sabres fell to Chaos and became the Crimson Slaughter of today. In this episode, we focus on events since their abandonment of the Imperium, including the war with the Dark Angels detailed in the Dark Vengeance box game, leading up to and including their role in the 13th Black Crusade. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Following Sevastus Cranon's declaration of secession from the Imperium, the companies of the Crimson Slaughter reorganized into smaller warbands, better to aid their raids upon the Imperium of Man. Cranon also learned of some of the many difficulties facing the leader of a renegade force. Firstly, the bonds of brotherhood and oaths of loyalty to the chapter master and formerly the Emperor no longer existed, and so the leaders would fight among themselves for right of leadership. This culminated in Captain Barkman, former commander of the 6th Company, challenging Cranon to a duel for control of the Crimson Slaughter, convinced by the voice in his head that it was his right to rule. Cranon defeated Barkman, slicing him in two with the Imperator Blade, a power sword wielded by all chapter masters of the Sabres since the amalgamation schism that we detailed in the previous episode. This silenced his detractors for a long while, but not permanently. Secondly, there was still some resentment amongst his brothers at their betrayal of the Emperor. Most of the former 4th Company, led by their captain Zalton, stole the ship Pride of Rogon, leaving the fleet. Their final message told Cranon that they would remain as loyal Crimson Sabres, and if they met again, blood would be spilt. From this point, this loyalist group of Sabres has returned to the rad-blasted planet of Rogon in a hope of re-establishing their chapter. They act in strict transmission silence, hoping to aid the Imperium whilst remaining undetected. The next major issue facing the Crimson Slaughter was that of survival. Although they no longer wished to end their lives on a sacrificial death quest, there was a very real chance that it might happen regardless. Numbers were dwindling from both casualties and desertions, and their strength was rapidly waning. Their fleet had suffered damage, several ships listing from encounters with hostile craft and the monstrous denizens of the Eye of Terror. Desperate to stop the voices in their heads, they could not stay long between fights, leaving them constantly on the move, seeking new quarry to slay so that they could stop the drift into madness. Before their excommunication, they had been self-sufficient as the Crimson Sabres. Like all Marines, they were able to service and maintain their arms and fleet. No matter where they went, behind them were all the resources of their homeworld in the Krakatoa system. From Drosh and previously Rogon had come a steady supply of replacements. The non-stop competition to be accepted weeded out all but the most worthy of aspirants to join the chapter. What they could not source had been provided by the Imperium. It had been their chapter's lot to collect a tithe of those pre-screened by the Scholastica Psychana to become librarians, or maybe join the Psychic Choir. To maintain their fleet, they sent likely candidates to Mars, as many Marines did, to become Tech Marines trained in the ways of the Machine God, and at dire need they could call further upon Forge Worlds. All that was now gone. Cranon and the Crimson Slaughter still had a major lesson to learn, the most basic of tenets for their new existence. To a renegade, nothing is given. It must all be taken. Years previous, Cranon had been promoted to Chapter Master, not because of his considerable martial prowess or tactical acumen, those were still obviously considerable, but rather due to his drive. Now, shaking off the malaise of doom that had hung over him since Humidia, he became a force of action again. He was now Cranon the Relentless. The Crimson Slaughter retraced their path to the floating space hulk Lost Hope, and they began to turn the drifting Colossus into a new base of operations. For those who do not remember, the Lost Hope was the space hulk scoured just before Cranon decided to reveal to the chapter that they were going renegade. As a result, they now had a clear base from which to establish themselves. It was perfect in a way. Those not working on the Hulk were sent out to launch horrific raids, relieving their madness by butchering anyone they could find. Many times they prowled along the shipping lanes that led out of the Eye of Terror toward the Cadian Gate, seeking prey, whether pilgrims or travellers, it mattered not. Upon their return, they would switch places, helping to overhaul the Lost Hope while their brethren set out to reap their own bloody harvest and sate their own bloodlust. It was during this period that they began to leave the Eye of Terror, returning once more to the Imperium, bringing with them nothing but red ruin. A mantra of theirs became, take from them everything, leave behind only corpses. How long this new routine lasted, none could truly say, but slowly the Lost Hope inched closer to becoming protectable as a base. Tech Marines and Servitors worked non-stop, never even removing their servo harnesses. Already, the nature of their mechanical skills was altering. They found they could bind the living energies of the warp into metal. Cranon looked upon his support crew, their betentacled gear writhing like living snakes upon their backs. He would have pitied them, if there had been such a thing as pity left in him. Instead, he urged them to work faster, adopting whatever means were necessary. It had been Cranon's intent to fill many of the large empty holds with prisoners. These could be turned into slaves and servitors to aid the slaughter. There was room to work with upon the Hulk because it was absolutely massive, composed of nearly a dozen different freighter-class spacecraft melded together through warp fusion. The problem was getting these prisoners. The slaughter were red-handed killers, eager destroyers who could readily unleash genocide. But as slavers, they had even less discipline than the greenskins, preferring to simply murder their prey. At best, they could grab plunder after they'd slain every living creature they encountered. They now had a base of operations, but Cranon knew the Crimson Slaughter lacked the ability to sustain themselves. Even as he debated over the next course of action, with the voices in his head, augers buzzed and klaxons wailed in warning. As large as the Lost Hope was, it was nothing in comparison to the enormous craft that materialized alongside it. From portholes and view bays, the Crimson Slaughter gazed out upon a monstrosity of a ship. It looked more like a hive city than any craft built for travel, and the Lost Hope was dwarfed by it. Escape was impossible. The Space Hulk had no warp engines and could do little more than drift in the wayward currents of that region. Cranon was preparing an assault when his comm hailers picked up an incoming request. Fabius Bile wished to announce his arrival and to meet with Cranon. Fabius Bile is one of the most legendary villains to beset the Imperium. He's a living piece of history from the mythic age when the first Space Marine legions betrayed the Emperor in the Horus Heresy. He was formerly of the Emperor's children, but now is a renegade amongst his own kind. Tales of his experiments and creations known to all Marines. Even the Imperium had issued warnings about his threat, for he was known to seek access to gene seed. Surrounded by his bodyguard, he strode the decks of the Lost Hope. He was impossibly old, over 10, maybe even 11,000 years old, and yet he moved with a sinuous grace, and an aura of menace surrounded him. He was also incredibly powerful. Having sold his genetic experiments to rebel commanders for millennia, he had amassed his own armies. His home, reputedly in Eldar Chrome World deep within the Eye, was rife with ancient tech genetic samples and the most successful of his new men. His eyes blazed as he mentioned his works and aspirations, saying, "Today's growth vat is tomorrow's victory." The Primogenitor, as he was also known, was the foremost expert on cloning and genetics. Yet despite burying himself in millennia of study, he was no less cunning a schemer. Through his network of alliances and promises, he had not only survived the power struggles of the Eye of Terror, but he had thrived, betraying so many patrons that he should have been dead 1,000 times over, yet always securing the protection of some other, mightier benefactor. With his army, he could simply seize what he wanted, but he found he gained more with bargains, and what he wanted was gene seed. Cranon was actually surprised by what Fabius Bile already knew about the former Crimson Sabres. Bile congratulated them with honeyed words and praised their decisions, but he offered more than mere counsel. He proffered help. Without being told, Bile already knew what Cranon's chief concern would be, the ability to create further Space Marines. The warband now was down to less than half of the full-strength Crimson Sabres chapter, and with no homeworld, they had no ability and technology for the creation of new troops. This, Bile could easily redress, but only at a price. Promises and pacts were easy to agree for Cranon, but the rest was harder. When he handed over to Bile those Crimson Sabres that refused to join him, the ones who had been locked in holding cells ever since their secession from the Imperium, he condemned them to a horrible, grisly fate. He emptied his holds of those former brothers, sparing only one, his true brother. But even that tiny trace of compassion, that would not last for long. And so, Cranon now had an established base of operations and a system for replenishing lost casualties. He was at last ready to unleash the Crimson Slaughter. Yet it was not vengeance alone that drove the renegades. They sought also to reclaim their sanity and halt the voices in their heads forever. How long it took the Crimson Slaughter to outfit their space hut base is unknown. They no longer kept records, and the passage of time was unpredictable inside the swirling arms of the Eye of Terror, well within its aura of disorder. Certainly, though, many decades were lost in this endless labour, and in this period they continued to launch raids in the Eye and into the Imperium. Due to the immensity of the Emperor's realm, over 1 million inhabited worlds, these hit-and-run assaults were hardly ever noticed. It was an era of war, and such battles and loss of life were rampant. Despite the inconsequential numbers, however, there was a rising concern. Although the raids were carried out by between 50 and 100 Chaos Marines, the damage was wildly disproportionate. Many of the inhuman foes inflicted gut-wrenching damage or perpetrated sadistic acts. This was normal. However, the Crimson Slaughter's raids were always bound to attract additional attention. Firstly, they were obviously Chaos Marines. A bitter foe for the Imperium and one Imperial agents did their best to cover up. Nobody likes admitting that your best was susceptible to heresy. Secondly, there was something far more sinister. Reports gleaned from vidcams, survivors were uncommonly rare, showed that these bloodthirsty killers were steeped in the mystical powers of the warp, accompanied by phantasmal forces into battle. The renegades left behind not just a trail of massacres, but another kind of corruption. Bone-chilling hauntings drifted in their wake, poltergeists lingering long after they had gone. These signs, becoming all too familiar in the 41st millennium, were normally the hallmarks of a different kind of incursion. On the agri-world of Grunwald, they destroyed entire communities before they left, but their presence was blamed for the wilted, bleeding crops that starved the continent. The raid that broke the Sentinel bunker on the moon of Tarkus left a series of jagged craters, which, when viewed from orbit, formed an enormous 8-pointed star. Witch hunters of the Hereticus studied the bloody trail, theorizing that this was the return of the corrupted Crimson Sabers. Space Marine chapters recruit by seeking out the best of mankind's natural warriors. That's why so many chapters recruit from feral or death worlds, such as Fenris, or Baal even has some very weird inhabitant things going on with it. Survival is not a birthright on those worlds, an achievement instead. The Crimson Sabers had recruited from feudal planets, worlds where warfare heightened the competition and ensured those who survived were the best marine candidates. And now Cranon sought to emulate their cycle. With help from Fabius Bile, great laboratories were set up aboard the Lost Hope. Chemvats, rows upon rows of them, grew the organs that would be transplanted into aspirants to transform them into initiates. The first few sorties into real space collecting potential recruits went badly though. The renegades either killed everyone, or the prisoners were too resistant to pass the first few stages of the process. However, there was a better answer already en route. The Crimson Slaughter were gaining a reputation, in and out of the Eye of Terror. With the Inquisition on one side, cultists were on the other. Many bands of cultists and lesser enclaves of rebellious Marines remembered them with angst, recalling their brutal attacks in the Renegade Wars before they turned traitor. But many more cultists were already flocking to their banner. In all human societies, power has a draw, but nowhere is that more true than in the Eye. Dark pilgrims banded together and left the repressive Imperium, searching for a new life, to make something of themselves. Most die, horribly, being fodder or sport for renegades and demons. To survive in that environment requires skill, toughness, and a certain psychotic edge, the same qualities produced by those most ferocious of death worlds that the Space Marines so love to recruit from. Some of the novices that actually made it to the Lost Hope were even young enough to receive the implants, though they still had to prove themselves to begin this process. Those who spent too long near the warp overflow were already too contaminated for their bodies to accept the organs, but they had a purpose too, fashioning them into servitors or just to join the growing faction of cultists drawn to join in the Crimson Slaughter. It took a long time, but the Crimson Slaughter's numbers began to wax strong once more, and Cranon knew it was time for a large-scale foray into the Imperium. There were many reasons why: a show of strength, a vengeful blow against those that betrayed them, and it would of course bring some temporary relief from the voices in their heads that had been there for decades, possibly even centuries now. But there was another reason that he didn't share so widely with his brothers. He was seeking a way to quiet the voices forever, and at long last, he had a lead. Following the warped dreams of this chief sorcerer Manon, Cranon had learned all he could about the mysterious artifact known as the Hellfire Stone. The voices were scared of this, redoubling their efforts to fill his mind with such garbage that it was difficult to think straight, and this alone led Cranon to believe he was on the right path. He'd learned that the Hellfire Stone's location was last guessed to be somewhere on the southern rim of the galaxy, and so he gave the command to gather all warbands, recruit cultists to swell the Crimson Slaughter's numbers further, and to prepare the entire war fleet. Thus began a rampage across a dozen worlds near the Veiled region. These were not raids, but full-scale invasions that swept over the planets like wildfire. The first to meet the onslaught, Verdfall. On the old charts and augur readings, it was under the Imperium's rule, so the Slaughter were kind of surprised to find orcs. The world had recently fallen to greenskin hands, and the Xenos were still busy scrapping over it. Within minutes, they were attacking on 8 fronts. They'd aimed all their landing zones on the most concentrated population readings, which is kind of harder to do because it's orcs, not Imperials. And this was the first time they went into battle not in raid numbers but with their near entire chapter, or a host nearly the size of one anyway. The cultists sort of made up the numbers. And the effect was startling. Perhaps it was quantity, perhaps it was savagery, but the paranormal activity around them was magnified. Balefire flickered about their eyes, coronas of lightning wreathed their helms, bolts of fire left weirdly incandescent tracer trails, and the shells screamed as they struck. Spectres loomed from shadows and discordant screeches wailed at the approach of the renegades. Paralyzed with fear, grots threw down their weapons, and as the chainsaw-like offensive of the Crimson Slaughter hit home, even the bravest orcs wavered and broke. They were mercilessly pursued, and cut down in their thousands. After days and nights of killing non-stop, the attacks were over and the Slaughter returned to their ships. There was no sign or augur readings to indicate the Hellfire Stone was on Verdfall. At least for now, though, the voices were silenced as Cranon plotted the next attack. The Crimson Slaughter's attacks across the Veil region were obviously very well documented, if subsequently suppressed by the Imperium. The remote nature of the planets and the speed with which they completed these massacres meant that by the time a distress call was received, the Crimson Slaughter were long gone. Only fast responsibilities of the Space Marines were suited to combat such rapid hit-and-run tactics. Thus far, no Guard or PDF had been able to withstand the fury of their attacks. The Astartes were alerted, and elements from several chapters were already in the region. Again and again, the Slaughter materialized from the warp and wreaked havoc, but Cranon was no closer to finding the Hellfire Stone. There were still hundreds of possible planets to search, but at last he had a clue, albeit a gruesome one. Hundreds of the last victims of the latest massacre all had the same angry pattern of welts upon their backs. At first, Cranon had assumed this was just another cult. They'd certainly come across worse. Indeed, more disturbing symbols and mutilations could be found upon the cultists that followed them into battle. But Manon, once their master librarian, now chief sorcerer, noted the symbols had manifested only after the Slaughter had arrived, some sign from the warp, as if trying to help them. Sure enough, once flayed and laid out altogether, the welts proved to be a skin map. The symbols and vector signs were coordinates. The map led to a desolate moon, a crater-struck wasteland. Scans revealed no arcane energies at all, and so Cranon was doubtful he would find the Hellfire Stone. But the augur readings revealed 2 beings, the only living creatures on the entire moon. Anxious to find out what the skin map meant, he led a bodyguard of his Terminators teleporting down to investigate. The ruins of alien structures revealed the moon had once been an outpost, but for what manner of Xenos? No idea. The landing party turned a corner to find 2 figures arguing. Both were clad in power armor, over which one wore long, enfolding robes. Although shocked to see interlopers, both strangers drew weapons and fired with an uncanny speed and accuracy. The fight was brief. For 5 Terminators, Cranon captured the black-armored foe alive, but the robed warrior, whose twin pistols had caused most of the casualties, eluded seizure, and mysteriously disappeared off the moon. It is my opinion that this individual was Cypher, the fallen angel, due to his appearance, use of twin pistols, and easy abilities to escape. Angry at the wasted venture, the renegades and captive returned to the fleet, giving the prisoner to Manon for questioning. In search of a hidden object, they instead discovered secrets hidden for 10,000 years. When the prisoner broke under mental probing and other more persuasive methods, Manon was able to reveal much about who they had caught. His name was Turiel, and in his secret past, he had once been a dark angel. Of his escaped accomplice, Turiel would say little, but this further consolidates my opinion that this individual was Cypher, fallen angels communicating with one another. They learned of the robot only that he arrived shortly before the Crimson Slaughter, for he had some premonition that begged Turiel to flee. Would have been better if he had, to be honest. Seemingly ageless, Turiel had crossed the galaxy over his long lifespan, fighting as a mercenary and even working alongside other renegades. However, he had repented and sought redemption in a solitary life far out on the distant edge of the galaxy. In his travels, he'd also heard of the Hellfire Stone and narrowed its location down. In a desperate bid to gain freedom, he even revealed where he suspected more Fallen could be found. For those who don't know, the Fallen were the Dark Angels who turned traitor at the end of the Horus Heresy, led by the arch-traitor Luther. These are the people who are responsible for the destruction of Caliban, the quote-unquote death of Lionel Johnson, though long-time viewers of this channel will know that Lionel Johnson is actually alive. But many fallen angels managed to escape, cast through space and time in a warp storm that engulfed the planet. Some became true Marines, and others went rogue. And some actually tried to repent, hiding within the galaxies and trying to achieve some good with their lives. That the traitors escaped their vengeance was a torment for the surviving Dark Angels, and so now the Inner Circle of the Deathwing and the Ravenwing lead the hunt to find the Fallen. What this led to became known as the Dark Vengeance. Cranon was fuming at what he had learned from Turiel. His own chapter had been excommunicated due to a misunderstanding, whilst the Imperium heaped accolades upon the guilty First Legion of old. The Dark Angels were also one of the chapters involved in the amalgamation schism that had first put Mara upon the Sabres in the first place, and that was just too much. The Hellfire Stone could wait. Vengeance was nigh. Now that he knew their secret, luring the Dark Angels into battle would be easy, but Cranon wanted his first impression to be something the Dark Angels would never forget. Small warbands were sent out tasked with capturing the Fallen that Turiel had spoken of, and Cranon got on with preparing the trap. He found what he was looking for in an ecclesiarchy world newly founded, named Stern's Remembrance. With no warning, the slaughter attacked with savage brutality. There was nowhere to run. Demon engines and hellbrutes waded through overcrowded streets, crushing victims with every footfall. 10,000 cathedral bells tolled, but their ringing was no aid. The resistance provided by the PDF and the few honor guard of Adeptus Sororitas didn't even slow the slaughter down. Only when the last inhabitant fell twitching did the renegades begin the next stage, piling the corpses into the cathedrals. They were stacked to the ceilings, a grim trophy mound. When all was ready, he ordered his sorcerers to send the Dark Angels a message, a vector, telepathic one, that would burn the coordinates into the body of whoever received it. But he didn't only send a map, for the message also named one of the Fallen who could be found there and mocked the Dark Angels. Amid the piled debt of Stern's remembrance, he left one of the Fallen. He wanted to make sure his foes knew that he knew of what they'd been up to in the past. The trap set, the slaughter left, returning to the warp to await the oncoming of their foe. It didn't take long. Strike Cruiser Pride of Caliban materialized in the sector and approached orbit. The 5th Company landed with twin Thunderhawks. Cranon gave them time to discover and appreciate what he'd done, and then he sprung the trap. The Crimson Slaughter rapidly deployed, and before the Dark Angels could extricate themselves, they were surrounded. There, battle ensued amidst the enormous stone edifices and winding streets. No match for numbers or ferocity of the renegades, the Angels retreated, fighting their way out. Although they recaptured a Fallen known as Attius the Untamed, they lost many battle brothers, including the Master of the 5th Company, Zadakio. The Dark Angels swore retribution against the renegades, but Cranon was overdue at that. He soon had the Crimson Slaughter back in search of the Hellfire Stone. But the Dark Angels were stalking them. On the surface, this was basically to atone for the loss of the 5th Company commander, but underlying that, a compulsive urge to destroy any who knew of the Fallen. The hunt was relentless, and on a dozen worlds ravaged by the slaughter, the Dark Angels arrived. Most were small skirmishes, advanced forces nipping at the heels of the renegades, but on the planet of Bane's Landing, the Dark Angels tracked down the Crimson Slaughter in force. For on Bane's Landing, Cranon finally found what he was seeking, the Hellfire Stone. This is the battle that was fought in the Dark Vengeance boxed game, and so this story may already be familiar to some individuals. Cranon needed to complete a ritual in order to get the Hellfire Stone. He needed to find an ancient altar and sacrifice a loyalist space marine upon it. Skirmishes broke out as the Dark Angels learned what their foe was trying to do and raced to stop them. Ravenwing bikers clashed with Dresnok's Ravagers, the chosen warriors who had fought by Cranon's side since he led the 1st Company of the Crimson Sabres. And Cranon was almost there. He almost got it done. But at the last moment, victory was snatched when his hard-won captive heroically sacrificed himself rather than allowing the slaughter to sacrifice him to complete the ritual. Bitterly, the outnumbered slaughter returned to the warp. After their battles with the Dark Angels, the Crimson Slaughter fleet returned to the Eye of Terror, and Lord Crannon was furious. He struggled with rage and, above all, the voices in his head. In the midst of battle, after bloodletting granted him a rare moment of clear thought, Crannon had an epiphany. He was being used, and badly. It'd be a near thing on Bane's Landing. As they attempted to wash the Hellfire Stone with the blood of a captured Space Marine, he had felt the skies grow black. He felt the twitching agitation from the voices that were now a part of him. It was not fear that they were feeling about this ritual, but joy. The words that had risen unbidden from Crannon during the height had not been his own, nor even in a language he knew, but it came to him that he had heard similar words before, on Eumidia. The Balthu cult had screamed those words. They sought to summon demons from their patron Khorne, but were denied the completion by Crannon and the Crimson Sabres that slaughtered them. The ancient magics of the Hellfire Stone were not meant to eradicate those inner demons, but rather make them stronger, intended to usher in a dark new age. Crannon's mind reeled with implications, and he returned to the Lost Hope to find it a larger, more vibrant place than the forlorn derelict hut they'd left. Word of the slaughter had spread wide, after all, and cultists, renegades, and traitor warbands had flocked to fight beneath their banner. The time Crannon had to think clearly was very short, and there was much to do. Decisions needed making before the madness grew inside him and the core of his forces. Also, the Lost Hope was now a powder keg, cultists and rival factions vying to win favour. A warband of berserkers had joined. They tired of the petty raids of other renegades and were eager to take part in the epic bloodbaths that had already made the slaughter infamous. To maintain control, Crannon needed a new war. His target? The world of New Redemption. After discussing the progress of the newly recruited, Crannon knew what the next target would have to be. It was clear the recruits produced were faring well. Those implanted with the organs developed from Fabius Bile's creations, however, were turning into monstrosities. What I missed there was the recruits produced from the gene seed of their own brethren were doing fine, but Bile's creations not so much. He needed more warriors, though. Many, many more, and there was only so much gene seed he could get from his own guys. To gain the more stable matter he needed, he'd have to seize it. After recent clashes and the vendetta the Crimson Slaughter had developed, he knew exactly which chapter he was taking it from. Since the destruction of Caliban, the Dark Angels no longer had a single recruitment world. Instead, they used a variety of different planets. The Rock, their asteroid HQ, replete with warp engines. It could travel between worlds and war zones as it needed to. Upon each world, they established strongholds, fortress monasteries to hold necessities required to implant and train new marines. The warp visions of sorcerers aided Crannon searching for recruiting worlds. On the ice-covered planet of Newmark, the Dark Angels had built New Redemption. Although the system was heavily populated, Newmark was furthest from the sun, a frozen world where the small human population fought the elements and ferocious beasts to survive, kind of like Fenris. These harsh conditions made for excellent recruits where the Dark Angels could select the best. And it was also a location the Crimson Slaughter could raid and get away from before the Imperium could really notice and get them. On the outside of the system, you come in, you hit it, you get out, you don't really get close enough to get the Imperium's attention. At least not fast enough, anyway. Crannon knew there was trouble the moment the attack fleet materialized. Above Newmark were 4 Dark Angel spacecraft, and further warnings announced spread of torpedoes rocketing towards them already. It would have been prudent to re-engage the warp engines and run. Even if they won, the defense lasers would be fully primed, meaning that Planet 4 would be very risky. Reinforcements might already be coming for the Dark Angels, but Crannon wasn't called the Relentless for nothing. He commanded the fleet forward, the gun decks blazing at the distant targets. There were 6 ships in this fleet, 2 of them primarily transports. The largest vessel was still the flagship Red Honor, but perhaps the most dangerous was the heavily shielded Scimitar, which mounted a brutal prow blade for ramming. Sorry, excuse my language there. Although several torpedoes struck home, the Dark Angels were just not ready. With all haste, they were already maneuvering to put the planet between them and the fleet of Chaos, which actually played into Crannon's hands. He didn't want a space battle. He simply wanted to drive the fleet off, denying orbital support while he got his forces down. They needed to hit hard, get the job done, and get out before the enemy fleet could re-engage. Wouldn't take long to discern what they were aiming for, though, an assault on New Redemption. The fleet wasn't powerful enough, nor did it have a numerical advantage to fight a battle, or at least not a large enough one anyway. The speedy escort-class Iron Wasp was first into orbit. As the smallest craft, it stood the best chance of avoiding fire, and the 3 warbands it carried were soon planet-bound. Their task? Silence the gun bases. As there was scant time, the next wave went immediately, transports Hellbound and Deathbringer entering orbit. Jet fighters scrambled to intercept the incoming assault craft, but were not prepared for Helldrakes that detached from the cloud banks, with Hades autocannons spitting death and denying half of the Angel's air support immediately, and the rest were quickly dispatched by rending claws or scythe-sharp wings on the Demon engines. Some landing craft did get caught though, but the ground fire was already dropping off as each orbital gun platform came under attack by the Slaughter forces. Enough assault boats landed that New Redemption was soon surrounded, and from out of screaming snow squalls, red-armoured renegades, scuttling defilers, and roaring hellbrutes came. No subtlety, because there was no time. The Slaughter had come to take what was theirs, and they needed to do it fast. For their part, the Dark Angels did know if they held out their distress calls would be answered. They deployed to the outer trenches prepared to hold off the invaders. But they never quite managed it. The Berserkers, Forge Fiends, everything else, it was just too much for them to handle. Their only hope was to deplete their attackers' numbers before they could close. And the Dark Angels didn't do too bad, but they were not prepared for the spectral wave of phantasmal forces that had become synonymous with the Slaughter washing over them, throwing off the shots of even the best and most disciplined soldiers. Too soon and too fast the red wave of death reached them. A last counterattack of scouts and armoured vehicles was crushed by the hellbrutes, and with pincer arms, the triple-sealed doorway was ripped apart by a defiler. Squads rushed in, sorcerers and dark apostles stalked the dead, extracting gene seed also. As the other warbands had destroyed all 3 of the defense lasers, they easily entered orbit and extracted the remaining Crimson Slaughter when the looting was done. Not a single Dark Angel survived. The Crimson Slaughter returned to the Lost Hope in the Eye of Terror. It was not an easy trip. The Acadian Gate was well guarded and the Imperium was restless, with great storms surging through the centre of the maelstrom and raw chaos energy pouring forward to sweep across the galaxy. The Eye itself was astir. Rumour of the 13th Black Crusade was building everywhere. Cranon, however, had other things on his mind. He had taken part in the battles on Newmark. The joyous act of cutting down Dark Angels had cleared his mind of the voices. How had he been so convinced the Hellfire Stone would lift the curse? Had the idea been planted in his mind by the voices? Others too had been involved. Were his own followers seeking to undermine him? Dresnok, who could see into the future, was he part of the plot? Did Manon, chief sorcerer, twist his vision so as to better manipulate it? Cranon had made up his mind and called for a council. Acting on an inkling, he knew just where to hold the assembly of leaders. The most fell-handed of his lieutenants filed into the very heart of the Lost Hope, the engine room, down into what was now known as the Room of the Orb. It was there all power cables and conduits ran, snaking through miles of passageways, spreading outwards like veins and arteries. Through them pulsed the lifeblood of the ship. 24 leaders of the 24 leaders of the Crimson Slaughter strode in, each wondering what this meeting might mean. To begin, Cranon didn't address them, but the orb, a great spherical fleshy mass. At Cranon's word, it opened. A great lid drew back, revealing a pulsing wet globe beneath. This was formerly Brother Sartok, a tech marine whose fervour to work closely with the machines took on strange roots in the eye. Now it was something more, a fusion of man, machine, and demonic energy. When it spoke, it did with no mouth, the sound instead emanating out of a comm station grown into the flesh. In Cranon's wanderings, they had engaged in many conversations before. Now Cranon asked the orb who it saw in the room. It listed them slowly, steadily, and in an inhuman voice. It also saw and named the spirits of Humidia, a fact Cranon had discovered long ago. Somehow the orb could see the spirits that the Slaughter had killed. He was hoping the orb would call out any other unseen manifestations, for it was Cranon's suspicion that one of his trusted captains had become wholly possessed. The last name uttered was Zaxlantar. I can't pronounce that, it's a demon name. Saying a demon's name speaks a word of power. In its articulation the room grew cold, a cold prickle running down the spines of all in the room. All save one. Forward stepped Manon, an iridescent shimmering rippling through his body as the demon stepped out of the former Psyker. It shed the power-armoured carcass as though shrugging its way out of robes, and the skin shell crumpled too. The creature grew, standing twice, now 3 times the height of his man, and still expanding. Spreading out its wings and stretching forth its serpentine neck, the greater demons of Tzeentch opened its beak wide and gave a long, mind-tearing screech of defiance. It gazed upon the Crimson Slaughter with eyes that sparkled with evil. Even as it tried to speak, Crannon fired his pistol to open the conversation. Though halted by a force field, it still caused the demon to pull back, and so began a brief battle, pitting the flickering warp flames of Zax'lantar against the blades and pistols of the Slaughter. Even surrounded and outnumbered, the demon was powerful, able to behead a warpsmith and melt many others. However, when the Imperator blade screamed through its defenses, it disappeared in a blink. The question now was, how long had Manon played host to Zax'lantar? It was unknown, nor was it possible to fathom when the manipulations had begun. Had he led the Slaughter to the Dark Angels? Was he involved in the string of events that isolated the Sabres, guiding the space hulk that corrupted the Krakatoa system all those decades ago? Had the agent been involved in the distress call sent from Numidia? Or was it working against the voices that possessed the Crimson Slaughter? No one really knew. But Crannon knew one thing. He vowed to behead the demon, declaring war upon Zax'lantar. The sorcerers could not trace him, as if the arcane arts refused to aid them, so Dresnok was called for. Dresnok was the champion of the Ravagers and had a third eye that saw strange visions. He went into a trance, shuddered, and spoke in a faraway voice of a planet named Myrmidrax. Little was known, except that it was located further into the eye than any had ever been. The directions chanted were more akin to ritual than to coordinates, but what use were maps when the stars moved according to the winds of chaos? Within the hour, the war fleet was en route. It was a very strange journey, but at last they made it. It wasn't a planet as they had surmised, but a rocky plain suspended in the void. Scans nor augurs worked, so they had no idea what awaited them. It didn't matter. Crannon led the warbands down, for they were too close to the centre of the eye to linger long. The plain was flat, rocky spires jutting upwards. The ground had a purple hue and was dotted with clusters of crystalline growths that protruded outwards in glare of bluish luminescence. The Slaughter formed up in a line and advanced. It wasn't long, however, before they were detected. Demons began to pour forth. Striding in the midst of the cavorting pink horrors and blue-hued flame creatures was Zax'lantar. The Lord of Change sent a bolt of eldritch fire crashing into the berserkers. Land Raiders and Defilers returned fire, sending their shots into the prancing ranks of demons. Thus began the Battle of Myrmidrax. Screamers dove down, gnawing through power armor to tear flesh. Flamers bounded forward, blasting gouts of fire, washing over the renegades harmlessly, in fact, but the cultists were lit up like torches, death cries adding to the cacophony of noise. A warp storm howled above, skies flashing, and from glass clouds came spinning cyclones. These whirled across the battlefield haphazardly, tearing gaps through the forces. Through the madness waded Crannon, Dresnok and the Ravagers by his side. They shredded horrors, biting towards Zax'lantar. Inexplicably, the demons' attacks were proving useless. Kaleidoscopic flames spread over the renegades, yet they stepped forth unscathed. Never had the spectral host materialized in such numbers around the Slaughter. Never had the spirit shielded them so effectively. To slow them down, Zax'lantar rained arcane doom upon his foes, but the onslaught was too much, and defeat seemed only a matter of time. Seeking a last chance, the demon targeted Crannon, drenching him with blue flame. But protected by the green-tinged spectres that hovered near him, the warlord emerged from the fire, blade ready. Screaming in 1,000 languages, the demon vanished again. Cheated, Crannon did not leave until every demon was slain, howling back into the warp. He vowed the war would continue until Zax'lantar was slain. Following their return from Myrmidrax, words of Crannon's battle with the Lord of Change spread like wildfire through the decks of the Space Hulk. Most of the Crimson Slaughter cared not, but many cultists quivered. They feared the demons, wishing them for allies and not foes. It was while deciding what his next course of action would be that emissaries of the Black Legion arrived at Lost Hope. Abaddon, War Master of Chaos, had taken notice of the Crimson Slaughter. It doesn't pay to lose sight of rising powers, even for those on top within the brutal dog-eat-dog existence of the Eye. None could match the size and power of the legions, and of those the Black Legion was the strongest of all. It is said that only Abaddon and his will can fuse the manifold forces, and now He looks at these newcomers. Who were these upstarts? Why had they not sent tribute or bent their knee? Was this Crannon another rival he must crush before he could finally finish the long war? The emissaries of the Black Legion brought a demand. Crannon should meet Abaddon and join the Black Crusade. If he didn't, he knew full well what would happen if he refused. Crannon had been a chapter master. He'd been in the presence of luminaries such as Marnus Calgar, Commander Dante, Grandmaster Azrael even. Yet none had the presence, the domineering presence that he felt when he stood aboard Planet Killer, the War Master's massive ship, staring up at Abaddon the Despoiler. With the voice in his head spewing advice, it was pretty hard to concentrate. When at last it was his turn to declare fealty, he vowed to join the Black Crusade, on one condition. The demon Zaxlantar was his to kill, same side or not. At Crannon's proud words, the assembled lords, demon princes, champions, and sorcerers froze. There were no conditions with the War Master. He'd killed for less. Abaddon had little patience for the foolish egos of lesser commanders. They would bow or they would die. But there was something about Crannon's bearing that Abaddon admired. Despite the rampages of the slaughter, they were efficient, something that still pulled to the old legionary part of him. Besides, none knew better than he the fickleness of demons. He laughed, welcoming the Crimson Slaughter to the Black Crusade, assigning them a place of honor amongst the attackers. One of the marks of a good commander in charge of a coalition is that he can use each separate formation to its best ability. The reputation of the Crimson Slaughter was for lightning-fast terror raids, and Abaddon chose them to perform just such actions in the 13th Black Crusade. While the bulk of the forces prepared to take the Cadian Gate, the Crimson Slaughter would sow terror deep within the Imperium. Losing no time, Crannon led the massed slaughter fleet to skirt the Cadian Gate, instead penetrating into the Imperium. Their campaign of shock and horror would draw off some of the support that would be rushed towards the Cadian Gate, but more importantly, it would put fear into the hearts of any who clung to the false hope of the Imperium of Man. Their first target, the heavily defended hive world of Regalis. Crannon was forced to make his plan en route. From the best visions his sorcerers could conjure, the defense batteries appeared to be concentrated around the continent-sized hive cities. With that in mind, the drop sites would be the Ash Plains, meaning a two-stage campaign. To break through the defensive barrier would be the first. Once they were through, the next phase would be to wreak havoc amongst the tangled inner hive, to massacre all they could to send a message to the other Imperials, a sign of what awaited them all. The artillery was already booming when they landed. In the distance they could see the first trench lines and knew casualties would be high. Dresnok had suggested masting the cultists, providing the most tempting targets for artillery, and it was wise, for much fire rained upon them. The advancing line shot in return, Lord of Skulls first, followed by Defilers and later by Havocs. The rest moved forward, closing ranks to fill the gaps blasted by artillery. On the far right, the tanks opened up, sending beams of bright lasfire into bunkers attempting to silence them. Rumbling out to meet them came tank companies of the Guard, their own guns blazing. The armour duelled, and the infantry closed. The trenches erupted in lasfire. Bright beams stabbed across the plains, but much fire was wild, a wave of wailing spectral horrors racing before the advancing lines. The guardsmen heard the calls of long-lost loved ones or saw demonic faces in the shadows. Some threw down their weapons and fled. Those that stayed were easily broken as the renegades stormed the barricades. So was the first line breached. Line after line fell. Bunker after bunker was cleared. The last was the most heavily defended. By that point, however, the wave of horror was so great, the psychic tension so thick that few defenders were left. The towering statues of mighty heroes were already weeping blood by the time the first renegade crashed through the gates. Now the true killing began, and none could stay the butchery. The last phase was the bloodiest. Disparate squads of guard and the remnants of their armour desperately attempted to defend the hab blocks, concentrating their efforts near the densest population centres. One by one, those strongholds fell, and the massacres began. Street by street, the battle raged, and the blood flowed. Howling spirits, maniacal laughter, both echoed down the long avenues, almost drowning out the chain swords, bolt of fire, and unheeded screams for mercy. Utter madness and cold-blooded slaughter came to Regalis, and it went on and on and on. Regalis was only the beginning, the start of the Slaughter's terror campaign. Tales of the genocidal horrors committed there would soon send shockwaves through the Imperium. Planet by planet, their doom was at hand. So ends the tale of the Crimson Slaughter so far. They are part of the 13th Black Crusade on a campaign of terror within the Imperium itself. None can tell when their story will end, whether they will fall attacking another bastion, whether Abaddon will tire of Crannon's desire to kill Zax'Lantar, whether the demon himself will strike the Relentless down, or whether they will stand with the War Master as he raises his banner above the Imperial Palace at the end of all things. One thing is for sure though, their story has been varied, tragic at times, brutal at others, but over, I found this to be an enthralling tale, and I hope you have too. Thank you very much for watching this video and for staying with me throughout this one. I know it's been a long one, and I apologise for that, but I thought this story was too good to pass up any detail. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all in the next episode. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and I will see you all again.